Hi, I'm Phil Potloff, head of AWS Enterprise Strategy.
And I'm Ben Kehoe, a cloud robotics research scientist at iRobot and an AWS Serverless hero. And we're here with Brendten. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Brendten Eickstaedt. I'm the VP of IT Innovation Services at Petco.
Awesome. Today we're going to be talking about application modernization and specifically how serverless technologies are influencing new architectures. Before we get started on your specific experience, I'd like to get your perspective on what our CTO, Verner Vogel, says about modern applications and really having a distinct set of patterns and characteristics that make them different from traditional legacy apps. Just wondering what you see as the key elements that make them different.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the biggest driver for it initially was the ability to not worry about infrastructure and not worry about the things that you have to worry about when you're building on traditional servers and even containers, and just giving the developers the ability to do what they need to do as quickly as possible. So really, from my perspective, it all stems from the need to move quickly and innovate as fast as you can, because you're always trying to outbuild the competition. And if you have to be held down by lots of infrastructure and those kind of things, it really does slow you down.
Yeah, I think modern architectures are serverless architectures, and they really help you focus on delivering business value, right? Fundamentally, we shouldn't, at this point, have to solve technology problems before we can solve our business problems. We should be able to just approach those business problems and select technologies that don't stand in the way. Mm-hmm. And for us, that means using AWS Lambda for our business logic and over 30 AWS services to deliver all the other components of a modern application that we need. But none of those are VMs or containers.
Got it. So when both of you first started using serverless technology, specifically in new modern application design, what were the driving forces? Was it cost, performance, scalability? What were the big factors for you? And what do you see being done today in the community?
Yeah, I think, as always, it's how can I do more faster? And in IoT, it's often a device company wanting to move into the cloud and not having the experience of building scalable elastic cloud infrastructure, and using serverless architectures helps you skip that. You rely on services that do that for you.
Yeah, from a retail perspective, we're really in that spot where we're best at developing business logic, and we're not great, or nor should we be, at building infrastructure or writing plumbing code and those kind of things. So from our perspective, it was really, again, it was just how do we leverage the knowledge and the expertise of others to build all those things out for us, so that we can focus on building the things that differentiate us in the retail space, as opposed to rewriting a database or building a new way of having cloud functions talking to each other or something along those lines. It's just not business value for us.
So presumably you weren't always there, right?
No.
Or perhaps aren't fully there yet.
Aren't fully there yet.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about what your journey has looked like.
It's been an interesting one. So when we started on this, it's coming up on 2 years ago now that we sort of started down this road of saying how can we get into the serverless world, and it really started out of necessity. We had a particular project that was very far behind, and we were really struggling to get it out, and a lot of it had to do with the technologies that had been chosen, and we just were very hamstrung with having to constantly battle with the technologies that we were trying to use. And we realized we needed a different way to do this. And so we actually started out and said, okay, well, let's write some Python and Django applications and use Zappa, and we'll just bundle that all up and we'll push it into Lambda. And in that way is where we started with the the serverless journey that we're on. It was just a matter of expediency and how can we eliminate the need to deal with anything other than the code that we were writing and the APIs that we were trying to get out the door.
Brendten, what would you say is kind of the pervasiveness of serverless within Petco today? And do you see it growing? And if so, how are you bringing new teams and onboarding them into a serverless architecture model?
Yeah, it's a great question. The area that I'm responsible for in the innovation space is really very much into this model. So we build everything in this way. We continue to try to build it even better, but continuing to build on serverless technologies because of the fact that it allows us to just get out to market as quickly as we possibly can. We have a lot of old legacy monolithic systems, and many of them are off-the-shelf technologies, and so there's a lot of challenges there. Will we ever get to 100% serverless? Almost certainly not, right? But there's a lot of things that we're doing to even take the best practices from what we're doing in the innovation space and moving those into some of the packaged software areas where we're pulling out, decomposing the monolith, pull out a service and make it serverless, make it a standalone entity as opposed to integrated into the whole. And as we progress, continuing to do it in that model, that's been very successful for us as well, as a way to not just in the innovation space, but also get it into the more enterprise side of the house.
And do you find that adoption being driven by sort of at what level? Is it the individual contributors? Is it the software development managers? Is it the sort of business decision makers? Who's driving that adoption? I
mean, it started out really as at the team level, where we made a decision as the engineers and the leaders of those engineers that this was the way we were going to do it. And again, it was expediency and saying this is the right way to do this right now. As the success has grown and been shown about how we've built things this way, it tends to be kind of osmotic in a sense, where engineers like to see other engineers being successful, and they say, how did that work? And then they start using it themselves. And so from the innovation space and the new builds, it's been pretty organic growth or organic spread across Petco in terms of this is a good way to build things. And the next phase, I would say, where we want to get to next is really going to require more architectural direction. So we're going to need to really start leaning into how do we build this as an enterprise? How do we use this technology as an enterprise rather than just how do we use it on individual projects, to build a specific thing?
What do you think that looks like?
It's going to be a combination of taking our overall domain of retail and breaking it down into the domains and subdomains of where you would align services, your bounded context, things like that. So really starting to align our architecture along those lines and figuring out even, if there's a monolithic piece of software that does a certain thing or a certain set of things, how do we encompass that or encircle that with bounded context still and provide interfaces into and out of that? In sort of lockstep or close to lockstep with that, we're going to be looking at how do we rearrange our organization along those lines as well.
Yeah, because one of my favorite topics, Conways Law, says your software architecture is going to match your org chart.
Absolutely.
And so if you want your architecture to look different, you may have to change your org chart.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in Conways Law, so I'm with you on that for sure. Over the years, I've found that you do have to, in a lot of cases, do it in lockstep or incrementally, or it's very difficult a lot of times to just go in and say we're redoing our org structure so that we now start building things this way, and vice versa as well. A lot of times it's very difficult to just come in with a blanket statement and say here's our new architecture, now everybody do it this way. So making incremental steps towards that and trying to move the architecture forward and then move the organization to align to that, and just continuously move in the direction we want to be till we get to the point where we think we are done, which you probably aren't ever going to get to, right?
And what do you think those incremental steps look like? So it's on the technology side, it's maybe building something using serverless technologies, but what's the incremental organizational step that you follow that up with?
I mean, I think, it's picking the right places. So where are the domains or the boundary contexts that are the most critical areas of the business? So we have some things that you just can't live without, right? I mean, you need to know your customer, right? So customer is a very important area of focus for us. So
I would imagine.
Certainly, and so you can start looking at those particular areas or those particular domains and say, how do we modernize those? How do we modernize that area? And then sort of kind of go out from there. You can say, okay, well, what does this touch? Now let's talk about how do we modernize those particular domains. And in addition, we've certainly got areas like my areas in particular that are a lot more greenfield. And so we do sort of have the opportunity to kind of leapfrog and do things much less incrementally. But when it comes to the overall architecture, it's just don't try to do it all at once. Pick some specific areas, decompose the monolith, wrap things that can't be decomposed with something that resembles a service or set of services, and just keep progressing in that way.
And when you're thinking about adoption and the areas that you want to push on, AWS offers services that cover sort of the whole range of software that you might be using, from your services that you're using in production, with handling customer data, to the CI/CD pipelines that deliver those pieces of software, to productivity software, all of these pieces. Where are you finding the value in pushing on that? Is it in the applications themselves, or in CI/CD, or everywhere? Like, how's that working for you?
Right now, we're seeing it largely in the services, the applications, being able to just program something or write some code to something that works, and interact with an SDK or push it into an API, and it's there and it's running, and you don't have to worry about it, and it does its thing. I do think that as we progress down this path, though, there's a lot of, particularly over the last couple of years, there's a lot of things that AWS has brought to the table in terms of tooling that I think we really should start looking into more, because of the integrated nature of it with all the things that we're trying to do. Spin up Lambdas and get your Elastic Cache running, and get your Aurora Serverless running, and just all the things that can still slow people down. There's a lot more tooling that AWS brings to the table that I think is going to help us really get even better at that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to follow up on it, when you look across the whole stack, what do you see as some of the critical areas that companies need to focus on when they're looking at serverless and decomposing their architecture, or building a new greenfield application, but matching their data stores, whether it's time series or document-based data store, and not the traditional relational data store? How do you see that adapting?
The reality of our world is that in retail, we're pretty much focused on transactional things. So you make a sale and you record it in a database, or something happens and you record it in a database. So really, we have pretty traditional data needs, mostly in terms of transactional ACID-based kind of things on our DBMS. So we don't have a lot of we don't veer too far away from that in general, but the natural solutions for that from an AWS perspective would be things like RDS, and we've even played around with Aurora Serverless. So trying to find ways that we can as quickly bring up the data store and keep the database development in sync with what we're doing on the code side is really important. And that's some of the ways that we've solved that. I think a lot of the challenges that we see is how do we match whatever the need is to the right piece of AWS, and how do we then make sure that the internal teams that are using that or would be responsible for using it, as well as the ones that are then supporting it, and ultimately responsible for making sure that things like security are handled properly, and governance has been maintained, and all those kind of things. Keeping them in the loop and really making sure that we're all on the same page is definitely a challenge, and it's something that we need to do a better job of. And I think everyone needs to be, as you go on this journey, you have to be very mindful of the fact that the tools that you're replacing have people that are responsible for them and that know them very well, and making sure that you're aligned on the lines of let's do this a different way is really important.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And Ben, I would ask you, as a serverless hero working with the community quite a bit, what do you think are the key elements of governance, security, and other considerations that customers should make when they're evaluating new architectures like serverless?
Yeah, well, I think, when I look at the shared responsibility model, it says that AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, and the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. Serverless services take that bar and move it so that more of that is AWS's responsibility. Mm-hmm. And the number of things that I have to secure and control is lower, because I'm not, on Lambda, I'm not patching the OS, right? And my exposure is lower because Lambdas don't accept incoming connections. Mm-hmm. Without some, very clever hacks that people have done, you can't SSH into a Lambda. People have managed to make it possible, but you have to do a lot of work to make it. And so I think, all of those stories end up being positive ones of now all of the actions that are happening inside my system are visible in CloudTrail. Now all of the controls that I'm trying to put on in between these pieces are secured with AWS IAM. And so all of that becomes, I think, for security folks, a lot more visible, a lot more observable, and the attack surface starts to go down, at least on the customer end of things. Mm-hmm. So there's just less you have to worry about at night.
I think it's an interesting point, and the reality is that it does reduce the attack surface. It should make the InfoSec people and the infrastructure people more comfortable. I think some of the challenges that you face, though, is they don't feel more comfortable with it sometimes. And so bringing them along for the ride and making sure that they understand what you're doing and that you're doing things right, and that they still are in control and things are being done safely and correctly is really important.
Yeah, and I think that serverless involves you no longer own your own destiny fully, and that's and it's okay, because what you're building is a relationship that involves trust, and trust is a journey. You're building it over time, you're repairing it, all of these things, and that the security part of that is the same story. You don't start out with, oh, I completely trust this. But you go and you read the artifacts, the certifications, all of the pieces that go into documenting how AWS does security, how the services are secured, how you secure things on AWS, and you start to build that trust, and then you start to run it, and then you gain confidence in it, you understand how it works better.
So one of the things that's interesting I see when customers start adopting serverless when they've been in a monolithic environment is that all of a sudden they realize they have all of these services that need to figure out how different teams operating on them independently need to communicate. And so, you have things like service meshes or AWS App Mesh that try to help fill the gap there. I'm just wondering what kind of principles or best practices you've seen in getting teams onboarded into using a serverless architecture model like that.
So for a lot of the things that we do, again, going back to kind of the way that we use it, is that we manage around the service domains. And so there's a lot of collaboration and interconnectedness in those service domains, and making sure that everything is tied together properly. App Mesh is a really good example. Those are the types of things that we use or look at using. At a larger scale, though, we try to keep fairly decoupled in terms of things that are not closely related in sort of a domain family. So those are generally pretty independently operated and independently run. But so it's a matter. It's kind of a combination of process and collaboration across the organization, as well as then things like App Mesh that allow you to programatize that type of thing.
You mentioned sort of the people who are buying in and the people who aren't. What are the main themes that you're seeing in resistance to serverless adoption, and how do you address those when you're talking with people?
I think the biggest one that we see, well, there's a couple actually, but probably the biggest one is that we just have so much investment already in things that are on-prem, and we have things that are on-prem that they're never going to go away, or it's going to take a long time for them to go away. And so then you've got things like, well, I have some Lambdas out here in the cloud that need to make calls back to these monolithic systems back in a data center somewhere. And it's slow, or it could be slower, or the connection could be down. Why wouldn't we just put that in the data center? So those are the types of, it's one example of the types of pushback that we get.
What's your answer for that?
So the answer to that is, well, the reality is that there's really not that problem in general. We don't see that problem. Quite frankly, the response times of the applications that we're calling into are far slower than the link going from cloud into a data center. So it's a false flag in a sense. So that's one response to it. Another one clearly is that we're moving quickly. We have a lot of things we need to get done in a short amount of time, and we just don't have the infrastructure in place to continuously be spinning up new servers and new VMs and all those kind of things to really keep up with the demand. And so we're willing to make the trade-off of potentially some cloud to on-prem slowness or challenges for the great upside that we get in terms of building stuff quickly and getting it out to market. So that's generally solves that problem when we have those conversations.
So one of the main threads of resistance or objections that people have to serverless is vendor lock-in. How do you perceive vendor lock-in, and how do you respond to people who raise that objection?
Yeah, I think there's a couple answers to that, or maybe more than that answers to that. But the one that's first and foremost to me, and the one that we use most often, is that the amount of work that it would take to build some sort of meta layer over this serverless thing that we're building on is really not worth the lift. And you probably aren't ever going to need it. And in the case that you do, you find out that the work that's necessary to actually take the code that you have in directly in the serverless cloud applications that you've built, that work is less than it would actually have been to just build this meta layer that was supposedly going to make it easier for you to move from cloud to cloud. So it's kind of not really an issue.
So I have one last question for you both. Most of the original thinking around how to use serverless technologies involved event-driven use cases, but it never ceases to amaze me how the millions of AWS customers are using our technology. And I'd just be curious to hear from you, what's the most interesting serverless application you've ever encountered? You want to start?
Sure. I'm kind of going to answer this in the way that I answered the first question about sort of how we got into this. And it's interesting to me because coming to Petco from a company that had used AWS and serverless in more of the traditional event-driven way, it was very interesting to me to see some of the ways that we ended up using AWS and serverless at Petco. And primarily for me, it's the getting that first project out the door that took years that it shouldn't have taken, and really doing that in a way where we just took a web app and wrapped it in a wrapper and pushed it up into Lambda, and used Lambda as really just a serverless wrapper to run a web application. And at first I was a little dubious about it, to be frank, but it works out really well. And it's not maybe necessarily the way we would always want to do things, but it got us over that hump, and it got us into a place that is much more further along in serverless than we would have been, I think, if we had not chosen that path.
a great place to start. Maybe not a great place to stay.
Yes, totally, absolutely.
And I think for me, having been serverless for a long time, there's a lot of sort of Rube Goldberg machines that you build before a managed service is available to handle it. So before API Gateway had WAF support, you could put a CloudFront distribution in front of API Gateway and put a WAF on that, and then hook some API keys with a Lambda to do the rotation of the key in between, like all sorts of stuff. But I'm also seeing, IoT firmware update handled by step functions. Right? There's a lot of things that you can a lot of processes, business processes, technology processes, that when you have a workflow engine, serverless workflow engine, you can just throw that at it, and you've got something you don't have to worry about anymore.
Yeah. Well, Brendten, Ben, thank you very much for joining me today. This was a great discussion. Thank you very much for watching.